The rain fell in steady sheets, veiling the bustling streets of Ashford in a silver mist. Clara Bennett gripped her frayed umbrella as she weaved through the crowded sidewalk, her faded sneakers splashing through shallow puddles. She glanced at her phone. Her shift at Rusty Spoon Diner started in under 10 minutes. Being late again wasn't an option. A few feet ahead, Nicholas Hale stepped out of a gleaming black luxury car, his broad shoulders stiff as he frowned at the storm. His tailored charcoal suit and crisp shoes stood in stark contrast to the dreary, rain-soaked street. Nicholas exhaled sharply, flicking his watch in frustration, silently cursing the weather for slowing him down. Clara, lost in thought, turned the corner quickly, colliding straight into him. Her umbrella tumbled from her hand, the metal frame clattering onto the slick pavement. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Clara gasped, crouching to pick it up, her hair damp against her face. Nicholas steadied himself, ready to brush off the interruption until his eyes met hers. Recognition struck him instantly. "Clara, is that really you?" His voice softened, disbelief laced in his words. Clara froze, brow creasing as she peered up at him. His face was familiar but distant, like a memory just out of reach. "Do I know you?" she asked, brushing a strand of wet hair from her forehead. "It's Nicholas. Nicholas Hale? From Fairbrook," he replied, his expression warm with nostalgia. "We were friends, years ago." Her eyes widened as the name pulled at long-forgotten memories. Summer afternoons in Fairbrook, bike rides along winding trails and tree houses they built in Nicholas's backyard flooded her mind. "Nicholas Hale," she repeated softly. "You left, 15 years ago?" 17, he corrected with a small chuckle. "But who's counting?" Clara let out a nervous laugh, brushing rain from her cheek. "You look different." "You haven't changed much," Nicholas said, smiling genuinely. "So, what brings you to Ashford?" Before she could answer, her phone buzzed, her reminder alarm blaring loudly. Need to get to work," she said hastily, fumbling to silence it. "Where do you work? Maybe I'll drop by sometime." Clara hesitated, then pointed down the street. "Rusty Spoon Diner, just a few blocks down." Nicholas nodded, committing the name to memory. "It was really nice seeing you again, Nicholas," she said, flashing a brief smile before hurrying off into the crowd. Nicholas remained on the sidewalk, his thoughts spinning. The encounter left him standing still, the rain dripping from his hair as he watched Clara disappear into the mass of umbrellas. "I can't believe I ran into her," he murmured, a faint smile pulling at his lips. As Nicholas returned to his car, the rain outside seemed lighter, though nothing had changed. Except him. The weight of memories stirred something long buried, and for the first time in years he wondered if fate was offering him a second chance. Clara moved briskly between tables, balancing a tray of steaming coffee mugs while scribbling down orders. The old jukebox in the corner hummed out faded classics, and the diner hummed with life. By the window, Nicholas sat quietly in a booth, the same seat he had taken every day that week. Each time he lingered in her section, ordering the simplest dishes, a cup of coffee, a grilled cheese, or apple pie. Today it was pancakes. Clara approached, setting the plate down with a playful grin. "Back again? You might as well apply for a job here at this point." Nicholas chuckled, his gaze soft. "Maybe it's the pancakes, or maybe it's the company." Clara rolled her eyes but laughed, tucking the tray beneath her arm. "Well, the company appreciates the tips. Keep 'em coming." Nicholas hadn't touched the pancakes yet, but his response was immediate. "They're perfect. I trust your recommendation." Clara leaned against the booth for a fleeting moment, a rare lull in her shift. "Guess my memory's not too rusty. You were always picky about food, refused to eat anything green, remember?" Nicholas laughed, his voice rich with amusement. "Guilty as charged, and you used to bribe me with butterscotch candies just to get me to eat my broccoli." Clara's smile flickered slightly at the mention of butterscotch, her mother's favorite candy. The thought passed quickly, and she shrugged it off. "Well, someone had to make sure you didn't starve." Their conversation drifted naturally toward the past. Those carefree Fairbrook summers, chasing fireflies and daring each other to climb the old oak tree near the creek. Nicholas stirred his coffee absently. "Funny, when I think of Fairbrook, most of my memories are with you." Clara's gaze dropped to the notepad in her hands. "Yeah, those were good times." As she walked away to tend to another table, Nicholas watched her, noting the subtle weariness in her step. She smiled for customers, but there was a tiredness behind her eyes he hadn't noticed before. "You work too hard," he remarked during her next pass by his booth. Clara shrugged. "Bills don't pay themselves." Nicholas hesitated, debating if he should say more. Instead, he simply offered a small but knowing smile. It wasn't much, but Nicholas knew one thing for certain. He wasn't ready to let Clara slip away again. The warm hum of Rusty Spoon Diner softened as the afternoon light faded. Clara Bennett balanced a tray of coffee mugs in one hand, weaving between tables with practiced ease. Near the window, Nicholas Hale stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, watching Clara as she moved through the room. "You know," Nicholas mused, a small smile tugging at his lips, "that when I think about Fairbrook, most of my memories are with you." Clara paused. Resting her tray on her hip, she twirled a pen between her fingers, eyes distant. "Yeah, those were good times," she said softly, the weight of nostalgia heavy in her tone. Throughout the evening, Nicholas noticed how Clara's energy waned with each pass by his table. She kept up her bright smile for the customers, but the subtle exhaustion in her eyes didn't escape him. "You work too hard," Nicholas commented as she refilled his coffee. Clara shrugged lightly. "Bills don't pay themselves. Besides, staying busy isn't the worst thing." Nicholas tilted his head, curiosity flickering across his face. "Do you ever get time for yourself? What about your art? You used to sketch all the time when we were kids." Clara's cheeks flushed as she shifted the tray. "I haven't picked up a pencil in years. Life kind of got in the way." Nicholas frowned slightly, feeling a pang in his chest. "You should. You were always talented. I remember thinking you could do something incredible with it." Clara smiled faintly, though there was a tinge of sadness behind it. "Maybe, but I had to grow up fast. Reality doesn't always make space for dreams." The words lingered, unspoken emotions hanging in the quiet air between them. Nicholas wanted to say more, to offer help, but something in her expression stopped him. As the evening stretched on and the diner began to empty, Nicholas overheard Clara talking quietly to a coworker near the register. "Rent's due next week," she murmured, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one was listening. "And I still need to send some money to Ethan for his tuition." Her coworker gave her a sympathetic look. "Those double shifts gotta help, right?" Clara sighed. "It's not enough, but I'll figure it out. I always do." Nicholas sat silently, his jaw tightening as he listened. Admiration for Clara's resilience grew in his chest, but so did a deep ache. He wanted to help, more than anything, but how could he without revealing who he had become? Later, as Clara approached to close his tab, Nicholas hesitated. "Do you ever think about what could have happened if we hadn't lost touch?" he asked, his voice low. Clara stilled, her eyes softening. "Sometimes," she admitted, leaning lightly against the edge of the booth. "But life has a way of pulling people apart." "Maybe," Nicholas replied, holding her gaze, "but sometimes it brings them back together." For a brief moment, the clatter of dishes and chatter of the diner faded into the background. It felt like they were the only two people in the room. A week later, Clara stepped nervously into the Meridian, an upscale restaurant glittering with golden chandeliers and polished marble floors. She smoothed the hem of her simple dress, feeling out of place among the lavish decor. Nicholas, waiting near the entrance, lit up when he saw her. "You made it," he greeted warmly, stepping forward. Clara forced a smile, shifting her weight. "Yeah, I almost left when I saw valet parking." "What is this place?" Nicholas chuckled. "Just somewhere I thought we could catch up. Consider it a treat." Leading her to a table near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Ashford's skyline, Nicholas pulled out her chair. Clara hesitated, glancing around at the well-dressed patrons and delicate linens. "Nicholas, this is a bit much. Are you sure this isn't over the top?" He met her nervous gaze with a reassuring smile. "You deserve something special." As the waiter handed them menus, Clara barely glanced at hers. The extravagant prices felt heavy, and she couldn't ignore the subtle disconnect between this world and her own. Nicholas, seemingly at ease, steered the conversation toward familiar ground. Old memories, shared jokes, and the quirky habits they'd teased each other about as kids. Yet, as he spoke, Clara couldn't shake the sense that something was hidden beneath his easygoing demeanor. "You're being unusually secretive," she teased, eyeing him over her glass of water. "What's this really about?" Nicholas laughed lightly, though there was a nervous edge to it. Can't a guy have dinner with an old friend without an agenda? Before Clara could respond, a tall man approached their table, clapping Nicholas on the shoulder. "Nicholas Hale! I didn't expect to see you here tonight." Nicholas's expression tightened ever so slightly, but he kept his composure. "Good to see you too, Eric." The man turned to Clara with a broad smile. "And who's this? Nicholas, you didn't mention you were bringing someone to celebrate your latest acquisition." Clara's brow furrowed. "Acquisition?" Eric grinned, oblivious to the sudden shift in the air. "Oh, you know Nicholas, always making moves in the tech world. The man's brilliant. A few months ago, he bought out half of our company's software division." Nicholas opened his mouth to interject, but the damage was done. Clara's eyes widened as realization set in. "You bought a company?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. Eric extended a hand to Clara. "Eric Stanton, CEO of Stanton Technologies. Nicholas and I go way back." Clara barely registered the handshake, her gaze fixed on Nicholas. "You're not just working some office job, are you?" she said quietly, her voice tight. Nicholas shifted in his seat, guilt washing over his face. Clara stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. "You didn't think to mention that you're rich?" "Clara, please, I didn't want to lie," she cut in, grabbing her coat. "I can't believe this." As she stormed toward the exit, Nicholas remained seated, regret heavy in his chest. The elegant hum of the Sterling room was interrupted by an unwelcome revelation. Clara Bennett's fingers tightened around her napkin as the words hung in the air. "CEO?" she repeated, her voice trembling as she stared at Eric Stanton, the man who had unintentionally pulled the curtain back on Nicholas Hale's hidden life. Nicholas shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Clara, let me explain." But Clara was already standing, the scrape of her chair echoing louder than the soft classical music playing overhead. "Explain what?" she snapped, eyes blazing. "That you're not just some ordinary guy, but a millionaire who forgot to mention it?" Eric took a careful step back, sensing the rising tension. "I'll leave you two to talk," he mumbled awkwardly before slipping away. Clara's gaze didn't waver from Nicholas. "Was this a game to you?" she demanded, arms crossing as if to shield herself from the weight of his deception. "Were you just slumming it for fun?" Nicholas stood, frustration flickering in his eyes. "Of course not. I didn't want my money to define us, or whatever this is between us." Clara let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You have no idea what it's like, working 2 jobs just to scrape by, worrying about rent while you pretend to be just like the rest of us." Her voice cracked with emotion. "That's not fair," Nicholas said, his voice low but firm. "I didn't mean to deceive you. I didn't know how to tell you without ruining everything." "You never even gave me the chance to decide for myself," Clara shot back, grabbing her coat from the back of her chair. "You've been living in some fantasy, Nicholas. But this is my life." She turned sharply and strode toward the exit, ignoring the stunned stares from nearby tables. Nicholas took a step forward. "Clara, wait." But she didn't. Nicholas sank back into his chair, running a hand through his hair as the weight of her words settled over him. The restaurant, once warm and inviting, now felt suffocating. "Clara?" he whispered to himself, watching through the rain-spattered window as she disappeared into the night. Outside, Clara hugged her coat tighter against the downpour. Tears mingled with raindrops on her cheeks as she walked briskly to the curb. Her chest ached with betrayal and confusion. "How could I have been so blind?" she murmured. A cab slowed and she climbed inside, grateful for the temporary shelter. As the taxi pulled away, she glanced back at the restaurant, her heart twisting when she saw Nicholas standing by the window, his expression heavy with regret. For the first time since reconnecting, the bond they had rebuilt felt fragile, like it might shatter at any moment. The following days blurred together. Clara buried herself in work at Rusty Spoon Diner, taking every double shift she could. Each long hour behind the counter felt like armor against the hurt. But no matter how busy she stayed, memories of Nicholas crept back in. His laugh, the way he had shared his lunch when she forgot hers as a kid, and those summer nights catching fireflies by the creek. She remembered his promise. "No matter what happens, I'll always have your back." Now it felt like a lie. One evening, as the diner lights dimmed for closing, a delivery man appeared with a bouquet of daisies, her favorite. Clara hesitated before accepting them. A small card peeked between the stems. "I know I messed up. Please let me make it right, Nicholas." Her heart tightened. She wanted to toss the flowers, sever the lingering ties that tugged painfully at her heart, and yet she couldn't. Days passed, and Nicholas lingered in the periphery of her life. Messages appeared on her phone, apologies she couldn't bring herself to answer. Patrons at the diner occasionally asked about the tall man who always sat by the window. Their innocent curiosity only deepened the ache. "You should give him a chance," Brenda, her coworker, suggested one evening during their break. Clara shook her head, tracing patterns in the condensation on her water glass. "It's not that simple." Brenda shrugged. "The good ones never are." Meanwhile, Nicholas wrestled with guilt. Growing up poor himself, he understood Clara's pride and hesitation. He regretted keeping the truth from her, but more than anything, he hated that she felt betrayed. He hadn't intended to deceive her. He just hadn't known how to tell her. But Nicholas wasn't ready to give up. One evening, after digging through old contacts, he found a way to act. Through quiet channels, he paid off a large portion of Clara's family debt. A handwritten note arrived with the receipt. "You've carried this weight long enough. You're not alone anymore." Clara stared at the papers in disbelief when they arrived. Her first instinct was shock, then anger. Who would do this? The note left no doubt. It was Nicholas. Gratitude and frustration tangled inside her. How could he interfere like this? But at the same time, how could she ignore the kindness behind it? That night, as she walked home under the flickering streetlights, her thoughts spun relentlessly. When she neared her apartment, a familiar figure stood beneath the lamp, his coat collar turned up against the wind. Clara stopped in her tracks. "Nicholas," she breathed, gripping her bag tightly. His gaze met hers, quiet and uncertain. "Clara, can we talk?" The cold night air wrapped around Clara Bennett as she stood under the flickering street lamp, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Across from her, Nicholas Hale's eyes were steady, his expression hopeful but hesitant. "Clara," he said softly, the sound of her name hanging between them like fragile glass. "Can we please talk?" She shifted her weight, maintaining the distance between them. "What are you doing here, Nicholas?" He took a step closer but stopped himself. "I couldn't stay away. Not after everything." Clara's jaw tightened. "You mean after lying to me?" Nicholas shook his head. "I didn't lie," he said, his voice earnest. I didn't tell you everything. I was afraid of losing the one real connection I've had in years." Her heart twisted at his words, but she pushed the feeling aside. "Do you have any idea how humiliating it was to sit there, realizing I've been talking to someone who could buy out this entire block without blinking?" Nicholas's gaze dropped to the ground for a moment. "I wasn't trying to humiliate you," he said quietly. "I was trying to be close to you, the way we used to be." Clara shook her head, blinking back tears. "We can't go back, Nicholas. Too much has changed." Nicholas's voice cracked slightly. "Maybe, but can't we try to move forward?" Clara looked away, her emotions crashing over her like waves. She wanted to trust him, to believe the boy she once knew was still standing in front of her, but the distance between their lives felt too wide. "I don't know," she whispered. Nicholas exhaled softly, reaching into his pocket. "If nothing else," he said, pulling out a small envelope, "let me give you this. It's not about money. Just read it when you're ready." Clara hesitated before taking the envelope from his outstretched hand. Nicholas stepped back, his eyes lingering on hers. "I'll wait for you, Clara," he said gently, "as long as it takes." Without another word, Nicholas turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain-drenched night. Clara remained there, standing under the glow of the street lamp, clutching the envelope as the wind whispered around her. Back in her small apartment, Clara sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the envelope resting in her lap. Minutes stretched into hours before she finally found the courage to open it. Inside was a simple letter. "Clara, you once told me that life has a way of pulling people apart, but I don't believe it has to end that way. I made mistakes, ones I'll regret forever, but the one thing I'll never regret is finding you again. I'll never stop trying to make things right. Always, Nicholas." Tears slipped down Clara's cheeks as she carefully folded the letter, tucking it back into the envelope. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of hope stirred in her heart, though she wasn't sure what to do with it. The following Sunday, The setting sun cast a golden glow over Fairbrook Park. Nicholas sat nervously on an old wooden bench, tapping his foot against the gravel path beneath him. The park, with its rustling oak trees and sprawling green fields, held years of childhood memories: bike rides, whispered secrets, and summer evenings chasing fireflies. It was the place they'd both cherished. In the distance, Nicholas spotted Clara approaching. She wore a light coat, her steps careful, her expression unreadable. Nicholas stood as she drew near, stuffing his hands into his pockets. "Hi," he said softly. Clara nodded, her eyes meeting his briefly. "Hi." They sat down together, silence stretching between them. Nicholas was the first to break it. "I'm glad you came," he said, his voice sincere. "I've been wanting to explain." Clara folded her hands tightly in her lap, her knuckles pale. "I think you owe me that much." Nicholas took a breath, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "When I saw you that day in the rain, it felt like fate gave me a second chance. You were always the one person who saw me for who I was, not for what I had." Clara frowned, looking over at him. "You didn't think I could handle it?" Nicholas shook his head quickly. "It wasn't about you," he said. "It was about me, about how much I've come to hate what money does to relationships. I didn't want to lose you again, not to something as shallow as my bank account." Clara's expression softened, though her voice remained firm. "I wasn't angry because you're rich, Nicholas. I was angry because you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth." Nicholas's shoulders slumped slightly. "I know, and I'll regret not telling you for the rest of my life. I thought I was protecting us, but I was wrong. I pushed you away." Clara's tense posture eased as she listened, the walls she had built beginning to crumble. "I missed you," she admitted quietly, barely above a whisper. Nicholas turned to her, his eyes filled with relief and something deeper. "I missed you too," he said, the words laced with emotion. They sat in silence, the distant sound of children laughing filling the air as the wind rustled the branches overhead. Nicholas finally spoke, his voice steady but gentle. "No more secrets, no more half-truths. I'll be honest with you, always, if you'll give me another chance." Clara studied his face, searching for sincerity. What she found there softened her heart. "I think," Clara said slowly, "I think we both need to learn to trust each other again." A smile broke across Nicholas's face, faint but hopeful. "I can work with that." A week later, Nicholas's name appeared on Clara's phone. "I want to show you something," he said. "Will you come with me?" Clara hesitated, but after a brief pause, she agreed. When Nicholas pulled up outside her apartment that evening, she slid into the passenger seat. They drove in silence, winding through the streets until Nicholas parked in front of a small art gallery. Clara frowned. "What is this?" Nicholas's smile held a flicker of nervous excitement. "Come inside, you'll see." Clara Bennett sat quietly in Nicholas Hale's car as they drove through the winding streets of Ashford. The hum of the engine filled the silence between them. Nicholas seemed uncharacteristically nervous, his fingers drumming lightly against the steering wheel as he glanced at her now and then. When they pulled up to a building glowing softly under the streetlights, Clara frowned. "An art gallery." "What is this?" she asked, stepping out onto the curb. Nicholas opened her door, his voice calm but tinged with excitement. "You'll see." As they entered, the warm buzz of quiet conversations and soft clinking glasses surrounded them. Clara froze mid-step, her breath catching as her gaze landed on the walls, her sketches. Drawings she had forgotten, buried deep in sketchbooks and tucked away in her apartment, now framed and illuminated, each piece treated like a treasure. I don't understand," she stammered, turning to Nicholas, her eyes wide with disbelief. Nicholas shifted awkwardly but met her gaze. "I found them in your apartment. I know I shouldn't have snooped, but—" "Clara, they were too beautiful to stay hidden. The world deserves to see what you can do." Clara's hands flew to her mouth, overwhelmed. You did this for me?" Nicholas stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I remember you saying how much you loved art, but life got in the way. I wanted to give that part of you back." Clara's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she took in the sight, strangers admiring her work, pointing, whispering. A piece of her heart she thought long gone now lit up under the gallery lights. "It's not just this," Nicholas added softly. "I enrolled you in art school. You can say no, but I wanted you to have the choice." Tears spilled freely as Clara looked at him, gratitude and disbelief swirling in her chest. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice trembling. Nicholas gently took her hand. "You don't have to say anything. Just let me be here for you, the way I wasn't before." Clara's fingers tightened around his, and as the evening unfolded, they wandered through the gallery together. For the first time in years, Clara felt like she was standing at the edge of a new beginning. Near the back of the gallery, Nicholas guided her toward the centerpiece, a large canvas she didn't recognize. "This one's new," he said, gesturing toward it. Clara stepped closer, studying the painting. Her breath caught as realization dawned. It was a painting of Fairbrook Park, the bench where they had sat only weeks ago, lost in their conversation. In the foreground, two figures sat side by side, their faces turned slightly away but unmistakably hers and Nicholas's. "I didn't paint this," Clara said softly, glancing at him. Nicholas smiled faintly. "I commissioned it. I wanted to remember the moment we found our way back to each other." She turned to him, her heart swelling. "Clara," Nicholas began, his voice thick with emotion, "I've loved you since we were kids, and I'll keep loving you for the rest of my life." As he lowered to one knee, he pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it, revealing a delicate sapphire ring, surrounded by tiny diamonds. "Can we start over?" he asked, his gaze steady and full of hope. Clara's breath hitched. Tears welled as she nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "Yes," she finally whispered, her voice breaking. "We can start over." Nicholas slid the ring onto her finger, and as he rose, Clara threw her arms around him. They laughed softly through the tears, holding on to each other as though the past no longer held them apart. For the first time, Clara felt like she had truly come home. Life found a new rhythm after Clara accepted Nicholas's proposal. They spent their days rediscovering one another, not just as childhood friends, but as two adults rebuilding something deeper. Clara hesitated at first, unsure of how their vastly different worlds could merge, but Nicholas's patience never wavered. "You make me feel like myself," Nicholas told her one evening as they walked hand in hand through Fairbrook Park. "No boardrooms, no accounts, just me." Clara smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "And you reminded me what it's like to dream again." Their relationship wasn't without its challenges. Nicholas's demanding career sometimes collided with Clara's growing passion for art school. But with each hurdle, they chose honesty, promising to meet one another halfway. Eager to honor their roots, Nicholas and Clara established a scholarship fund for underprivileged students in Fairbrook. "We both know what it's like to struggle," Clara explained during a meeting with Nicholas's foundation. "If we can help even one student chase their dream, it's worth it." The Bright Future Scholarship was born. Together they visited schools, sharing their story and inspiring hope in those who needed it most. One afternoon, after speaking at a local high school, a shy girl approached Clara, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you," the girl whispered, clutching a brochure. "You've shown me it's okay to hope again." Clara smiled, squeezing the girl's hand gently. "Never stop hoping," she said. A year later, on a crisp autumn evening, Nicholas and Clara attended an art exhibit showcasing her newest collection. The gallery buzzed with admiration for Clara's work, but as always her focus drifted toward Nicholas, her quiet champion through every brushstroke and late-night project. As the evening wound down, Nicholas led her to a private section of the gallery. The walls were lined with paintings, snapshots of their life together. Fairbrook Park, the Rusty Spoon Diner, their first walk after reuniting. Clara turned to him, her heart full. "What is all this?" Nicholas smiled softly. "It's our story. And I think it's only the beginning." Clara Bennett's step slowed as she entered the final room of the gallery, her hand lightly trailing along the edge of the doorway. To her surprise, the space was filled with paintings, portraits of places she and Nicholas Hale had shared. The Rusty Spoon Diner, the bench in Fairbrook Park, even the very gallery that had first displayed her art. Clara turned to Nicholas, her eyes wide with wonder. What is all this?" Nicholas smiled softly, stepping toward her. Without a word, he knelt down, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. His voice trembled with emotion. "You've painted color back into my life," he said, looking up at her with nothing but love in his eyes. "You've shown me the beauty of simplicity, the strength of hope, and the joy of love." He opened the box, revealing a delicate sapphire ring, shimmering under the gallery lights. "Clara, will you marry me?" Tears welled in Clara's eyes, spilling over as she smiled through them. She knelt beside him, her voice a soft whisper. "Yes," she said, barely able to steady her breath, "but only if you promise to keep being the boy I fell in love with." Nicholas grinned as he slid the ring onto her finger. "Deal." Their wedding was a reflection of everything they cherished, a simple yet elegant ceremony held beneath the sprawling trees of Fairbrook Park, the very place where their paths had crossed again. Under a canopy of twinkling fairy lights, Clara walked down the aisle in a flowing white gown, a bouquet of wildflowers in her hands. Nicholas stood at the altar, his eyes glistening as he watched her approach. "I feel like the luckiest man alive," he whispered when she finally stood before him. Clara's eyes shimmered with quiet conviction. "And I feel like the luckiest woman." As they exchanged vows, their voices carried the weight of every challenge, every reconciliation, and every tender moment that had brought them to this point. There wasn't a dry eye among the guests. Their first dance as husband and wife was to the soft melody of a string quartet, the music drifting gently through the night air. They swayed slowly, foreheads touching, lost in their own world. "You make me believe in forever," Clara murmured against his shoulder. Nicholas smiled, his arms tightening around her. "And you make forever worth believing in." As the evening stretched on, laughter and joy filled the park. Guests mingled beneath the stars, toasting to a love that had weathered storms and grown stronger because of them. Standing at the edge of the celebration, Clara leaned her head on Nicholas's shoulder, watching their family and friends dance beneath the lights. "This," she whispered, "is everything I've ever wanted." Nicholas pressed a kiss to her temple. "And it's only the beginning." In that moment, surrounded by the soft glow of lights and the warmth of the people they loved most, Clara and Nicholas knew they hadn't just found a happy ending. They had discovered the start of a beautiful new chapter. Thank you for joining us on this journey of love, resilience, and rediscovery. Nicholas and Clara's story reminds us that true connections withstand the tests of time, challenges, and even life's unexpected turns. It's a reminder that love, when nurtured with honesty and hope, can create new beginnings and lasting happiness. If this story touched your heart, let us know by liking, sharing, and leaving a comment below. Your support means the world to us. Don't forget to subscribe to Stirring Stories for more inspiring tales celebrating the beauty of love, the strength of the human spirit, and the moments that change lives forever. The most moving stories are often the ones closest to the heart. See you next time.